Now we should be live on YouTube and on Instagram, so welcome. Very, very good to be back again this week. As usual, very happy to be with you and to be talking about languages. And today I wanted to talk about something that's quite close to my heart, and that is Indigenous, endangered, and vulnerable languages. As many of you who follow me and have heard from me before, you'll know that I'm quite passionate about Indigenous, endangered, and vulnerable languages. There are quite a few reasons for this. First of all, my own heritage language is a language that has been through a lot, and I had to go back and reclaim that language from my family. That language is Welsh, and so one of the indigenous languages of the islands where I'm from, and I belong to that group. So I feel very connected in a personal way to the whole topic of indigenous languages in particular, but also endangered and vulnerable, because sister languages of Welsh, whilst Welsh has enjoyed a revival and it's a lot better, thankfully, there are other languages that are related to Welsh, sister languages like Cornish, that weren't as lucky in centuries gone by, and the Manx language on the Isle of Man, and indeed all of the Celtic languages have had this decline in numbers, and it's a struggle and a fight to get those numbers back and to reclaim heritage. And I wanted to talk about this because obviously with the Polyglot Conference, one of the really core tenets for me is giving a stage to people who speak or are from communities where these languages are from. Indigenous, endangered, and vulnerable languages often need support from time to time from people from outside of their community, because unfortunately what tends to happen, and this is kind of where I think it's important as outsiders, we recognize our place, and our place is this: we go to a place with a type of privilege as a foreigner going to another place. So that privilege can be used in many different ways. We can deny it if we want, but as somebody who has white skin from Europe going to Mexico, there's a certain interest in me learning Nahuatl, for example, as the local indigenous language of Cholula, where the Polyglot Conference is going to take place at the end of October, than there is, for example, local people speaking Nahuatl. Because as a foreigner going over and learning that language, I benefit from a number of things in terms of my privilege going to Mexico. And learning the language is seen as almost like, wow, oh, you already speak Spanish and now you're learning this. Isn't this amazing? And it's really cool, or why, or a curiosity. It's a talking point. But the people that actually speak it in the communities, it's not often talked about in the same way and in the same light. But what we can do when we talk about it is raise that platform for other people who are perfectly able to talk about their own communities and their own languages, and do on a daily basis. And the hope is that we just shine a little bit more light on that by leveraging that privilege that we have as foreigners going to a different place. But that is exactly it. It's leveraging our privilege to help raise the voices or shine a light on the people who are already doing that stuff from their own standpoint, from their own communities. It's not us leading the way, because that's not our place in this discussion. So this is kind of what I like to do with the conference, and I like to use the conference in that way, that we get to talk about things that are important, not just to us as an international community, but also about the people on the ground, the communities on the ground, who for them is their reality, and that's their ordinary day-to-day thing that they deal with and struggle with and see play out in a whole range of different ways in their lives. And when I put this online that I was going to talk about this topic, I got some really interesting questions and thoughts, and I want to start with those because I think that actually they give some really good context. The very first one that I got was actually from Norma on Twitter, and I just love the questions. So Norma asked 3 questions, and I want to there's a lot to unpack on this topic, and for me personally, yeah, I mean, there's a lot that I can identify with as well, from what happened to people that came before me, and the fights that had to happen for us to be able to use Welsh as a language in Wales. And as absurd as it sounds, that's a fight that had to happen, so that there was a struggle to get the rights to do something as simple as write a check in Welsh in Wales. And these kinds of struggles tend to be mirrored to different degrees in the Indigenous communities around the world, or vulnerable language communities, or endangered language communities around the world. First of all, let's talk about the distinctions before I get to the questions, actually. So Indigenous languages, vulnerable languages, and endangered languages. So an endangered language may not necessarily be one that we see as necessarily Indigenous. It depends on what indigeneity we're talking about. Some languages are given these titles over others, or before others, for different reasons. A lot is also to do with the power balance and what's happening in different societies where these languages are spoken. Also, talking about Indigenous peoples, for me, is problematic. It's good in a way because it binds people together. The thing is, like every single group that we try to put together in one ball to sort of pigeonhole, what we find is that actually they've got that thing that they can say, I identify with a wide group, but the reality actually is quite different. So you see this play out on social media quite drastically, where the conversation, particularly, and I'm going to focus on indigeneity and Indigenous peoples here, where an Indigenous people of North America will not understand the struggles and history of the Indigenous peoples of, say, Australia or New Zealand. And their struggles, whilst they do have similarities, are different. Because, and not just even within those different communities, but also within the communities, there are different opinions, different experiences, different struggles, different needs, different wants, different desires, different visions for what all this means. And I think I will dig deeper a little bit into that when I get to some of these questions, because some of them are quite thought-provoking questions. But I do want to just put that out there, because just because one person is Indigenous does not mean that they're going to get everything that other Indigenous people feel. The same way as just because I have white skin does not mean that I understand the thoughts and ideas and share the same values as everyone else with white skin, or someone with another color skin, or someone with a different religion. All Christians are not the same. All Jewish people are not the same. All Muslims are not the same. They may have things that link them in some way, but they're not all the same. And treating everyone as a big group, it's all the same, is often quite dangerous. But also, we need to take a more granular approach quite often. Groupings can be useful for certain things, and I understand why we have a need for their existence in society to order things in certain ways very often. But as individuals, when we're talking about it and when we address an individual, we actually need to address the individual and not that person necessarily as a representative of the group, if that makes sense. This is where I think then politics plays a part, and people have leaders of communities and things like that. These are other problematic areas, but I'm not going to go into that now. It's way beyond the scope of this discussion. So everything I say here is from my point of view and how I see things and my experience. And I just want to make sure that is absolutely clear, because it could be a very different point of view from anyone else who has Welsh origins or speak Welsh, and it could be different from any other Indigenous person around the world. And also our privileges are going to be different as well because of the indigeneity in the mix and all that kind of stuff. It plays out very differently all across the world. So just to put all of that out there before we go into this. So Norma asked, the first question that Norma asked was, why is there so much hate towards them in the country where they're spoken by few? It's really interesting as a topic. So hate is a strong word, often, and I would say that this is where also the wider community is not necessarily always the same, but there can be quite loud voices. Particularly, you see this where there has been a type of colonization of an area. These bigger languages and bigger powers that have basically dwarfed the indigenous peoples and local communities. It becomes very complicated because they take with them a number of ideas, values that go over to those new communities or remain in the communities with the people that stay there who have originally come over. And it does get very muddy. What you can see is, and I can talk from sort of an English speaking point of view when it comes to Welsh people, is often English speakers can be quite paranoid when they hear another language that they don't understand. It's this kind of feeling that, oh, they're saying something about me. And many English speakers feel this when they hear another language. It's a common thing that you hear when people are on holidays or when they hear languages spoken on the street in a place like the UK. They can feel almost threatened by it, and threatened not in a way that they feel that their life's in danger, but they feel that they may be talking about them and feel uncomfortable. So it makes them feel uncomfortable, and you'll have seen many examples of this on the internet where English speakers have like shouted things at people speaking other languages, whether that's an indigenous language like Welsh or whether it's a language that's arrived onto the shores of Great Britain, like Polish or something like that. You would often hear that kind of thing happen. Is it always the case, though? No, it's not. And what you sometimes find is almost an acceptance of English has won, or Spanish has won, or French has won. So let's just speak the bigger language. And that is something that was almost ingrained in the people themselves and a lot of indigenous communities themselves, where it was felt that passing on your language was a negative thing, was giving your child almost a handicap and to be seen differently, to not have the opportunity to learn English or French or Spanish or whichever community this is, as well as the people who are monolingual. And that reality is what affected my family. That's what happened in my family, that it was seen as a bad thing to pass on Welsh. And to get on in the world, we need to make sure our kids are good at English. And that's the kind of, that's what happened to my grandmother. Her parents were first language Welsh speakers, and they didn't pass on the language for exactly that reason. So times were very different, and I think when you look at these things, and it's easy to judge, but also times were very different than they are today, and have to also consider the lens of what the reality was in those days compared to now. Nowadays, it's very different with technology. I'm talking to you from an office in the Balkans via the internet. And wow. And I'm talking to you on a topic that I can talk about freely and openly. I am allowed to be able to do that because I have certain privileges with freedom of speech to be able to do that, and not feel that my life is in danger because I am talking about the Welsh language. The good thing now is that society in England has and English speakers in Wales who don't speak Welsh as a first language, or maybe even at all, they are at least usually open-minded enough to be able to listen to somebody speak on these topics like I'm doing now. And so the line has moved, and I want to recognize that the line has moved in my society where I'm from originally, and it has moved. This isn't the case everywhere, and yes, I think that whilst I can talk about from my point of view, there possibly would be similar stories that you would hear. I have heard similar stories out of Mexico where people thought it was an advantage for the children to just speak Spanish. And why would you need this indigenous language? I have heard those stories. There are also other things as well that come into play. People who belong to those societies sometimes feel, because they haven't been given the opportunity to learn the language, it can be quite an awkward feeling when other people come and learn the language. So they almost want, there's almost a kind of a, well, that's what we spoke in the past, and let's just accept that and move on to what we speak now, which is English or Spanish or French, or whatever. So there are quite mixed reasons why, and I don't know if I'd call it hate, but sometimes it is hate, absolutely. But I think the biggest issue is more than hate is actually indifference, apathy, just not bothering at all, not having any feeling about it. I mean, at least with a strong feeling either way, you've got a start of a conversation. With apathy, you don't really have much of a conversation about anything. It's like, whatever, you do what you do and I'll do what I do, and that's kind of it. And there is a positive to that in a way, because it's live and let live. You just do what you do and I won't bother you. But it doesn't cause much of a conversation, and it doesn't raise the voice as much, strangely, I think sometimes. So that's exactly what it took for people to care enough about Welsh and being able to do things they did in English to get the rights to be able to use the language in Wales, and to get education, and to be able to go to write a check in Welsh at the bank. When I was living in London, I was, because of the people that came before me, I was privileged to be able to have my phone installed in a flat in London through the medium of Welsh. And I don't take that for granted. I could press a button to say I want to have this installed in Welsh, and I skipped an entire queue of people waiting just for English and went straight to the Welsh queue and got my phone installed in London through the medium of Welsh, which is actually, yeah, a lot of fun to be able to do that, and it's very enjoyable. It felt very rewarding as somebody who reclaimed the language, but also it felt good on. So it felt soul nourishing, is how it felt. And so yeah, I think that we do need to care. So if you have a viewpoint that these languages are pointless and why bother learning them, at least you care enough to have that view, if that makes sense. I think it's a dangerous topic to sit on the fence with. I think it's a topic that we do need to have a view. And whilst I'm not necessarily for or against, um, a lot of things myself, there are things that I think it doesn't really matter how you feel in some ways for some things, you know, whether like a certain flavor, for example. Well, it doesn't really matter. You may just be indifferent to it. If it's there, it's there, and if it's not, it's not. You don't care. But something that deals with us and our identity, I think it's nice to be able to have, and it's important to have people with strong feelings. We may not always relate to them, and that's fine too. But at least we can listen to each other and hear the arguments and talk to each other and make points made, get our points made. I think that's the important thing. So the second question that is in here from Norma is it possible to keep them afloat if the media talks more about them? Yeah, if media talks more about these languages and about where you can go to learn them, supports them in helping them be distributed and easily found, and I think we are seeing some of that for a lot of languages, which is really encouraging with the internet. I think that would help. The thing that I really like right now, and I've been through this process of learning Indigenous languages, or at least picking up some of Indigenous languages and getting into communities on several occasions. At the moment, I'm studying some Nahuatl to go to Mexico. I've been studying Cornish for the last 2 years, and been doing some Irish and Scottish Gaelic, and I've done some Northern Sami, and also Maori I looked at a couple of years ago. And the experience of doing all of these things has been really rewarding, like really rewarding. So doing more of that is important. Let me give you an example of 2 other languages actually that you can't really describe as Indigenous but are endangered or vulnerable that I've studied as well. One is Kristang, which is a language spoken in Malaysia and Singapore by a few hundred people, not many more. And then the other language is Ladino, or Judeo-Spanish, which is, again, a language that I think, thanks to the internet, has really taken advantage of this international community that can get behind it. So it's a really good news story in terms of connectivity. It started with this whole email group that they were able to talk to each other, and then it's kind of developed even more from there. But it still faces its own challenges, right, with survival. But yes, I think the more we can help to get stories out about these languages, particularly in the countries where they're used and spoken, where there might be interest in people learning them, to help bolster those communities, to interact with those communities, to get them the support to make it because if a language isn't a living language within the community, and people don't join the community and interact with the community through the language, it makes it a lot more difficult to keep the language growing and keep it strong. Numbers, when it comes to Indigenous languages, are actually surprisingly not as important as the vitality of the language. And what I mean by the vitality of the language is it being taught to children? Is it being used on the playground? Is it being used at home? And is it therefore being used in a community that is continually sort of generating new generations of those speakers? And if it is, then you could even have a couple of hundred people, and it might be a very vital language in terms of its ability to survive. But if the number of children speaking it is in decline because there's no education in it, because they're not being encouraged to speak it or use it, because people in homes are stopping the use of the language, keeping it as a secret language between parents because they think the children need to speak the bigger language, the more important language of the country, then that's where we need to sort of redress the balance. So even though we've got a language like Nahuatl, for example, with an estimation of 1.2 million speakers, sounds like it's a huge language, right? And it potentially is, but where are the pressure points? Where are the pain points on that language and the community of people speaking it? Is it accepted fully? Is it possible to get education in it fully? I'm not sure how far that goes. And that's a question for sure for people of those communities, and for us as individuals as well, when we look at which languages we're focusing on, what that actually translates as. Number 3, the question I got from Norma was, are there spelling bee? Oh, if there are spelling bee contests for English, can this be applied to learning speaking endangered languages too? That is a really nice idea. I really like that idea in terms of where that's come from, Norma. And I think ideas of like doing something through the language, like a competition that you reward children for learning the language well and speaking the language well, or spelling the language well as in terms of a spelling bee, I think really, really nice idea. It would need some modification from many of these languages for a few reasons. So English has spelling bees because English is English, and English has almost zero logic when it comes to spelling. And so words are hard to spell because English spelling systems don't map on very well to the pronunciation of the language. And so it becomes difficult to spell a word. If you have a letter for sound mapping within a language, it's phonetic in terms of what you read is what you say and what you say is what you read, then it can fly out the window a little bit in terms of the need for a spelling bee per se. But you could have that as a poetry competition, an expression of the language. You could have it as some other type of competition. So the idea of the competition, or the valuing of good speakers, good spellers for English, but good speakers of the language, people who have really looked into it, or people who do projects and look at the etymology or words and how they fit together, and they could present something on that kind of thing. These kinds of ideas are really nice for kids and for people to really take pride in these languages. So I really, really like that you put that forward, because actually I didn't think of putting that into this today, and I really like that you did that. So thank you. Yeah, a competition like the Eisteddfod, exactly. So in Wales we do have this, and it's really really good. I mean, for Cornish even, so I'm doing my Cornish studies, and they have exams you can sit and take. So I've done grades 1 and grade 2, and having done those 2 grades now for Cornish, I can carry on and do grade 3, which I've started studying for now, and I can do grade 4, and after that I can become a bard of the Cornish language. So it's kind of this really cool thing that even though when I first started, I couldn't imagine that I would end up studying it that far. Your Cymro, yeah, well, yeah, my family is originally from Carnarvon in Wales, so yes. Yes, so yes. Let me see. Okay, so more questions. I had some other questions as well. Okay, how do we in the longer... Okay, so Derek says on Twitter, how do we in the largest group sense encourage the few remaining speakers to insist on the use of their language, to be bold enough to remind us relentlessly that they exist? There is so much competitive noise, maybe a sales pitch would help. Sometimes it is a bit like a sales pitch. Not every community, as I said in the beginning, not every Indigenous community or endangered or a vulnerable language group community is the same. They're all very different, with very different histories, very different flavors, very different pressure points. All of those things play a part. So yes, potentially there is a sales pitch. I mean, it's got to be very carefully crafted in terms of, you're selling why it's important to speak the language, almost back after many centuries often of people being beaten into the ground with things that have gone on historically, whether they've been colonized or subjugated to being sort of outcasts of a society because they're of a community, yeah, I mean, there are many reasons why that happens, right? And they're very painful things to tackle. And so when we go and we do these kinds of things, and when we talk to people about these kinds of things, we've got to be very mindful about who we are and where we're coming from and how we're perceived. So, for example, it needs to come from a place that's authentic. It needs to come from a place where you're kind of doing it, but you're listening to them. The biggest mistake I see made with any Indigenous community or vulnerable or language or endangered language community actually is that we often go with our values, and try and put our values on that community, and that's the exact wrong way around to do it. We have to listen to how they feel and what's important to them, and see if we can work together on that, and see if that language thing is a common ground. But it may not be number one for them, because there may be so many other things going on. And just because we love languages, it doesn't mean that that's what we can impose our values on that community straight away either. And this is why sometimes I think you can come across a lot of barriers when you're trying to access these communities and talk to them and stuff, because there needs to be some sort of gatekeeping for these communities sometimes, because it's a very sensitive issue, and forcing our way through that gate with power isn't the way forward. The way forward is knocking gently and asking who's home and what's happening in the house, if they're happy to talk about it, and then making friends and building trust, and showing your interest, yes, but unfortunately our a sales pitch itself, as in like selling something back to somebody, that's a tricky one, because there's so much history involved, there's so much unpicking of what's happened, of historical events, that not everyone's there with it. And I'll be very, very honest with you, when it comes to these communities, and we see this in Wales, you see it in Scotland, you see it in Ireland, you have people in those communities who just speak English and are very happy just to be speaking English. They exist. And they have a right to feel that way if that's how they feel. That is a valid feeling for them. Not everyone has the same feelings about the past or reconnecting. Not everyone has that same feeling as I do or someone else might do. And I respect that as well. So when you knock on the door, you don't know who's going to answer the door either. And you've got to be ready for someone who's got very different values and very different viewpoints to your own when it comes to these languages and when it comes to these communities. So I love these questions and thoughts that you've put forward. These are amazing. They're really, really good. Okay. Still got some more questions, and they're all long questions. I'm sorry about this, but I think they're important. So on Instagram, I got a question. What do you think when people say that non-Indigenous people shouldn't learn Indigenous languages? Okay, so if somebody were to learn my heritage language, Indigenous language, Welsh, I'd be very happy. So from my point of view, I'm very happy if somebody wants to learn Welsh, and I don't care where they're from, what they look like, what their religion is, what their gender is, what anything that defines them, in terms of anything else. I don't care. If that person is into learning Welsh, I'm very, very happy. So yes, I think that most Welsh speakers I've spoken to would feel a very similar way. I would hope they do, but I can't speak for them all. There would be some that maybe might not feel that way at all. But that's how I would feel about somebody coming and saying that, as far as I'm concerned, the language is there to be used and spoken, and to understand a vehicle for culture, and to interact and to connect to the place and the people, and you can become part of that, and you're welcome. And I quite like the attitude normally in Wales for Welsh speakers is that it's great that you're learning and you want to learn. Is that the same everywhere? No, it's not the same even in Wales everywhere, but there will be people that have different views, and that's fine. But my personal thought on gatekeeping, and I know that this is a big topic in the US particularly, because there's a lot of talk about cultural appropriation. And so I want to take that idea of cultural appropriation, which some of you may get and be on board with, and some of you may not be on board with it at all. And I want to make an important distinction that I heard on TikTok, actually, I thought was really important. And that was the difference between going and learning a language and trying to do it authentically, as the people who use that language, I think is showing the utmost respect for that community, or at least the people in that community you are dealing with. Somebody might disagree, and they're okay to disagree. But I think it's a very, if you're speaking it to a community and you've got access to that community and they are speaking it with you and you're using the language, then that is a show of respect. Okay. But if you go into a language community, you learn the language and then you disagree fundamentally with all of the speakers, and you try and take the language in a direction that the speakers do not want to go in, or that community does not want to go in, and you make it your own in terms of you take away the culture that's attached to the language and move it away from it completely without that community being on board with it. Or you speak the language and you almost disconnect it from the culture to the point that you make it a purely linguistic thing that you do, you just use it as you want and you don't even acknowledge half the things that are from it. You just, whatever you do with it. But that's a show of potentially disrespect. And that's where I think the cultural appropriation issue comes into play. Tough thing to discuss, not easy to discuss, but people do feel very strongly about that kind of thing. So there are communities that will vehemently gatekeep a linguistic knowledge because they don't necessarily want that, and they have their own reasons for that. Those individuals may be a minority or a majority, but as far as I'm concerned, if you have a community within a linguistic group that are happy with you using the language and speaking the language, look, it's for them to decide how they feel, and for you to decide how comfortable you feel with that as well. You do have a little bit of a say in terms of, and you pick up on how comfortable you are. For the most part, in my experience, that feels very theoretical. It feels also very US oriented as a discussion. And the US does not own the license on this discussion. In fact, they often take it in a way that is not something that other Indigenous communities in other countries and other continents would agree with. And I've seen a number of arguments based on that from people in the Pacific regions of the world and elsewhere, where a US point of view and idea is almost looked at as being put on top of everyone, and it doesn't work that way. So we have to take it all, each language as it comes. In terms of the reality, my reality of this, I've never ever had anybody say to me, you shouldn't learn my language. It's highly disrespectful. Or don't learn my language. Or I don't want to speak to you in my language. Or don't try and learn to pronounce it properly. No one's ever said that to me. Ever. And the reason they don't is because most people are generally quite nice, and building a connection between another human being and showing them the respect of learning a language, whether it's an Indigenous, endangered, vulnerable language, or almost any language, it's you giving an olive branch out to that person, and usually they accept it. I mean, I've never known anybody react badly to this. It does tend to be arguments with people who don't do it or are not involved in the language learning community that I hear these issues. But is it an issue if somebody learns an Indigenous language? Not necessarily, no. And I don't think that, as I say, that there would be an entire Indigenous community who would not want you to learn, unless the North Sentinelese, for example. Okay, that's maybe one example that I can think of off the top of my head. The North Sentinelese have made it abundantly clear that they want no contact with the outside world. and I can't blame them from the contact that they've had. But other than that, I can't really think of any examples of languages that we would usually try to learn, where that would be a big issue on a sort of a general rule. You don't learn that language. I've never really come across that. Even when I mentioned North America and North American ideals for opinions from North America, particularly that are people can sometimes superimpose on other areas of the world. Even in communities like that, where I've met people from Indigenous communities, they've been very happy to talk to me and very open and very kind and very welcoming. And even you see courses that are given in a number of North American Indigenous languages. And so, yeah, that idea of people saying, no, don't learn it, I've not come across it so much. It tends to be, as I say, from people that aren't in the community or aren't involved. They're almost virtue signaling often, and or imposing their values on other people that are not really shared or there. The other comments I got here was, even in India, many vulnerable languages are on the way to become endangered. We must save these. I like that you've got that that attitude, Devin. Thank you. I agree. I absolutely agree. There are so many of these language communities, so many of them, and yeah, I think it's really good that you've got that attitude that you want to do that. And then I like this. I got a comment. What do you think about or like learning one of these languages? And I would love to learn one of these languages. Okay, and then this is the final question. My word, it's been over 40 minutes just on questions, but I hope that you've enjoyed this sort of questions I've got and the answers that I can give, or from my point of view. Final one is from Mitchell on Twitter, and that is, Richard, I'd very much like to hear you tie this important topic to bigger issues of what motivations beyond predominant ones like desire to travel, consume commercial culture, or make money might lead us to study precisely these types of languages. Really good question. Really good question. Okay. So, as I mentioned before, from my own family as well, it was seen as a disadvantage to speak the Indigenous language, the heritage language, because speaking English was seen as economically more viable. You have more opportunities, more ways to use it. So why speak Welsh? And so, yeah, and that opinion is still going around many communities around the world. So how do you then, if some of the communities still feel that way, how do you then get people from other parts of the world to feel that, or with outside of those communities, that it's worth learning? Well, here's where I stand on this. If you yourself come from a community, or you can at least, you feel a tie to a community that has one of these languages, then the only thing I can say to you is this: the feeling you get when you reclaim that language is undescribable. It's not like learning a foreign language in the same way. I mean, people do things, like people have different spiritual beliefs, and that's the thing that I can possibly use as an example of how it feels learning a heritage language, learning an Indigenous, endangered, or vulnerable language of a community that you have a link to. Whether that's you have a link to it through blood, through some other relationship, you moved there. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter. If you're there, particularly I can speak for Wales, if you're there, you belong. Okay, and you have a right to learn Welsh and to enjoy what it means to go around the country and hear the history and understand what these words mean and see the names of different places and have a deeper understanding of why they're written that way, what they mean, how they feel, any stories connected to them. You get this in Mexico all over the place. Mexico is full of words and things and ideas from indigenous languages spoken all over Mexico. And it's like, if you go to Mexico and you're an English speaker and you learn Spanish, it's like seeing Mexico then in a kind of, you see more colors of Mexico, for sure. So if you go in English, you see Mexico almost in black and white. But if you go to Mexico and you speak Spanish, you've got most of the colors. If you learn and study the indigenous language of the region you're going to, it's almost like you start getting these really strong colors through that you can appreciate. It's like all the flowers smell nicer. It's like all of the tastes are just intensified. Everything is just intensified. That's the hook, I think. Let's not pretend that that the immediate change is going to be financial or something like that. If you're after the financial thing, then maybe that's not going to be the right motivation to carry on studying. But this is the big but. Life doesn't have to be either or. This is what I see as a false dichotomy. So it's similar to when people say, why study lots of languages and not study them very well? And you can study one and study it really, really well. Okay, but when are you going to use it to the level you only study to like PhD and beyond? How many people will be able to have those conversations with you at that level, that depth? How often? And how often is your language you're going to be using actually going to be quite day-to-day stuff that is maybe max B2? You can still do that and still learn the other languages. It doesn't detract from that study. So you can still do your PhD and speak that language, and you can enjoy those conversations when they arise and still enjoy the B2 level that you normally use for chit chat, daily communication. And you can also take other languages to that level. Same thing is true for these languages, right? You can study Spanish or German or French or Mandarin or whatever you want to your heart's content. But you're going to get to a point where you've got to a point where you actually can use that language then. And adding the other language doesn't change it. It just adds to your perception. And I would actually say that learning one of these languages, an endangered, vulnerable, or indigenous language, actually really changes your perspective. Because what you start seeing is hearing stories from a very different point of view. Many of you all have heard the expression, history is written by the winners. Well, the winners, in terms of the ones with more people to beat the other nation into submission or other group into submission, and not always into submission, but just to dominate them in whichever way possible. But how often do you actually hear their story and on their terms, not a version that's polished? And you don't get that polished version when you start learning the languages. You get the version that they use and they say. And so the reward of understanding the world and the people in the world that little bit better is way, way better than any financial gain. For me, I mean, I hope I hope some of you can identify with that, but you can still do the financial languages that get you the money, but you can still do the other thing as well. The two things can run in parallel. You don't have to choose. It's not either or at least it doesn't have to be either or. It's a bit of a false dichotomy. Try and make yourself choose between one or the other. You can do both or more. You can even get to a point where you feel just confident. You don't have to take everything to the nth degree. If you're interested in physics, it doesn't mean you have to then go and work in Geneva at the Hadron Collider, right? Just because you're interested in learning something more about physics, or if you want to learn a bit more about the moon and how the moon works and the features of the moon, doesn't mean that you have to then go and work at NASA and then try and get on a rocket to the moon. you can still enjoy what you know about the moon at a deeper level than you could before you knew anything about the moon, and all you did was look up at it. Same as with languages. You can just enjoy that extra depth, that extra flavor, that extra vibrance in the color or colors of the societies where they exist, where they have existed, and that have set the bedrock for names, traditions, foods, all these kinds of things. And that 50 minutes I've been speaking for. This is the longest I've spoken for without taking any questions. I'm sorry that I haven't taken any questions, but I did get some really thought-provoking things, and I hope that what I said was useful, and that many of you could agree, or at least agree to disagree. If you didn't agree, you could agree to disagree, and I'm happy to read if you've got differing thoughts as well. My view on life generally is this: I'm happy to read and hear from people that have a different opinion and a different viewpoint. If I weren't, how would I be able to ever reevaluate any of my own beliefs or thoughts? I may not agree with what I hear. I may not even like what I hear, but I can at least hear it. And so I really hope that you can share as well. And if you've agreed with me, I'm very, very happy. Yeah, I'm really, really happy if you agree with me. But I think talking about this, and I've just seen, Joanna, okay, wow, in Breton, you've written, Joanna, yeah, Joanna. So what we can do as well when we highlight people who speak these languages or use these languages or want to improve the use of the languages in their communities, whether it's getting them introduced in education, talking about them, getting involved in that dialogue, using and leveraging our privilege in these communities can really, really help to raise voices that need to be heard, to put pressure sometimes on politicians who don't feel motivated to give the support that's needed for these communities to reclaim their heritage language that I was extremely privileged to be able to do because of the efforts of the people that came before me. So if I in any way can help any of these communities, even in the smallest way, just by showing that they matter and talking about it, then that's made me a very happy person indeed. I'll have a look and see if there are any questions that I've got. Cymru am bydd. Yeah, diolch. Yeah, wir. Let's see. Dim pobl o'n gwbl. Dwi'n dallt. Okay. Chwiafond, yeah. Hello, sorry, I've missed all of these hellos. You want to learn the Karelian language, but you can't find any teaching resources. Might it be better to learn Finnish first? Alphonse, potentially Finnish. There are certain languages that actually, where linguists have gone and documented the languages quite well. Now, not always popular choices at the moment, but Russian often is quite a good language to have to explore some of these indigenous, endangered, and vulnerable language groups, because a lot of Russian linguists have gone off and mapped them and made courses. So it's actually quite a good language. And for Karelian, for example, that would have been my first thought, would have been Russian, strangely, and not Finnish. But there may be things in Finnish. I don't know. I do know Russian texts and resources do exist for a number of these languages. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Joanna. I keep saying Joanna. Why? Because the Macedonian way is Joanna instead of Joanna. I'm so sorry. I just read it and my brain just goes straight to Macedonian when I read names sometimes. And a Russian always уже знаешь, хорошо. Ты можешь по-русски, я думаю, что по-русски это будет еще лучше. Is Catalan considered one of those endangered or vulnerable languages? Oleg, no, I don't think it is. There are many speakers of Catalan. I mean, there are more speakers of Catalan than there are Swedish, if you take all of the variations, and if you include Valencian as well. There are more people, and also they are official languages in and taught through schools, and they're quite so they're quite vibrant languages, and their vitality is actually quite strong. Do you think independence movements such as the one for Wales help further or damage the cause of endangered languages? I think they help to raise the topic and get people off the fence, is what I think. I think they help get people off the fence, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The important thing to remember when we're off the fence is to still listen to the other side to see if we still agree with the way things are going. Sometimes even within movements for these languages, there are differing opinions. Okay, Cornish had huge struggles with agreeing a common writing system. So they finally did agree Swift, they call it, which is a standard written form, okay, as a base standard. But there are still many people who use the common form or use Middle Cornish more or some other form of Cornish. You get differences even there. That's also important to say for a language like Nahuatl, for example. Like I'm learning that at the moment. There are different spelling systems, and they are spelling systems based off the colonial powers that came and documented the language at the time. So you have ones based off French or English, and ones based off Spanish, and then you have ones that use, sort of the K's and the Q's and whatever else, and then you have ones that don't. So the important thing to remember is this, and this can be quite, when you're looking for, particularly for materials for languages like this, is the language is usually the language is the language is the language is the language. And yes, it can be a bit more frustrating and confusing as a learner, but if you persevere with one of them, the one that you have the connection with a person or people, go with that, and you'll find that over time you'll start to make sense of the other ones. It's like now, if I were to, when I first thought about Cornish and I saw the common form Kemin, found it very confusing. But now, if something's written in Kemin, I just read it. I don't really care. And even with Nahuatl at this very beginning, very early stage in the language, I see things written on TikTok and on YouTube and on Instagram and in different places in other versions of the language. And I can see where they are with the logic, and I just carry on with the way I write it, the way I'm being taught to write it, because you kind of have to pick up one, right? You can't do everything all at once from the beginning, from the start. It's just impossible. So you pick one, you pick your own team, you go with that, and then debates within the language community themselves, with who speak the language and look after the language and the people and the culture. That's a separate thing, I think. Espero que estés bien. Muchas gracias. Estoy bien, gracias. Buenas tardes. ¿Cuál es el dialecto náhuatl más difundido? Es una buena pregunta, no sé. La verdad es que para decirte la verdad, no lo sé. Quisiera saber algunos nombres de libros en español o en inglés para aprender. Gracias. Flavio, lo que puedo hacer es hacer un vídeo sobre mis aventuras con Nahuatl y voy a dar más información sobre esto. Si quieres, por ejemplo, hay en Zaloa, donde estoy aprendiendo ahora el idioma, hay un curso que tú puedes decidir hasta cuánto quieres dar como para comprar el curso. Puedes decir, pues que no tengo dinero, pues no puedo, pero como quieras tú. Y eso se encuentra en el sitio web de Zaloa Languages, que es Go Nahuatl. Y puedes ver en Google, puedes hacer en Google así como Go Nahuatl, escribir allí y luego vas a ver. Eso para empezar. Pero voy a hacer un vídeo. Me parece importante. Richard, do you know Isel Mazard, he talks about the indigenous languages of Canada and the importance to protect them. I don't know. No, I don't know that person. Isel Mazard, I don't know. I don't know him. But I'll see if I can find more out. Or if you've got more information, please let me know. Yeah. Really important conversations to have. Absolutely. Indifference is the great mind killer. Absolutely, Joanna. Absolutely. My word, I'm butchering your name tonight, Joanna. I'm so sorry. I don't know what's going on in my brain. I think, I'm so sorry. I think that there should be more talk in those languages rather than about them. Yes, I agree. I'm going to caveat that though. I agree, but sometimes when we talk in the languages, some of those people that need to hear the message switch off when they have to read the subtitles, or they don't have subtitles. But yes, for certain conversations, they do need to be in the language as well. I think it's important to actually have the language represented in a meaningful way. So that's where I absolutely agree with you. And it needs to be something that we show as a valid tool for communication, and not just talk about it as, oh, it's great, isn't it wonderful? It needs to be shown as a valid tool for communication and for highlighting information and giving people information. Yeah, I agree with you actually, John. Yeah, the more I talk about it, the more I absolutely agree with you. The only exception I'm going to say is that when we're talking about learning the language, because the discussion like I'm having now, if I were to do this in Welsh, well, it wouldn't really help that much, because I'm basically, it's like preaching to the choir. People already know the benefits of speaking Welsh usually, or you know, they sort of the kind of, they'll be listening to it because of that, and not because of people that maybe are interested in knowing how thoughts could be about those languages from a language that they already speak, which many times is English. For many of these you know, the language that from where I'm from, it would be English. Obviously, French or Spanish would also be equally good to talk about these, so people start to get the idea that actually, no, it is important. And also, there's a weird thing when you speak in English or you speak in Spanish or in French about these languages to other people who speak them, and there's almost, they can identify with you. So they're like, oh, this person sounds like me, speaks like me, and they have this differing idea, they have this different thing that they talk about. Sometimes that can be quite powerful, actually. Whereas if you speak the other language, sometimes that can be a barrier for them, and they almost, like, you know, psychologically, it's like, no, they're speaking Welsh. Why would you bother that? I mean, that's kind of, you know what I mean? There's that as well. But generally speaking, I absolutely agree with you. Yeah. I found some servers and resources to learn Selkup, fantastic, more the northern and southern dialects, but unfortunately I don't know nearly enough Russian to take advantage of the resources available. This is one exception, actually, when you talk about language, people talk about, I want to learn this language to be able to learn the next language. The one exception where I think this is actually really, really good, and I wouldn't say, no, just learn the language, is these languages. Sometimes it's better to learn a language that helps you access the resources better, and other people who maybe speak the language to different degrees. And often what you'll find in these communities is that they will mix in the local language. So you get this a lot with with a number of linguistic groups, where they will mix in words from the more prevalent linguistic group, and so yeah, that's why I say learning Russian often can be a good way to access some of those languages, or whichever country you're in. Okay. Piraha is another example of a different numbering system. Okay. A number system with maybe two or few. Yeah, it is. Yeah, there's actually, we had someone come to talk about that at the Polyglot Conference in Ljubljana, so you can check that out about the Piraha language. Okay, in the USA, I have heard that there is an Indigenous group up north that does not feel similarly regarding non-Indigenous people learning their language. Several statements have been put out that, unless you are part of the group or have been invited into it and trusted especially, you may not have access to their resources and their information, and they are entirely entitled to do that. That's their decision as a group. If they have unilaterally decided that, that is their decision. And that's where we say, okay, and we respect it and we move on. We may ask if they want to talk about other things that are important to them, but if they want to be left alone, we leave them alone. That's it. You know. Let me see if there's any other questions here. Certain information such as stories and even words can also be limited to share claims or languages initiated into a secret society or only to men. Oh, I think I'm missing half of the conversation. I'm sorry. I read that out and I was like, maybe I'm missing something. But possibly, I don't know. I can't comment on that very much because I don't know. Okay, Jid, how about Lakota language? Can you recommend us some books for learning it? Lakota, I'm very sure that there is a course that takes place. So if you Google the Lakota Summer School, you will find lots of links to the Lakota language. And oddly, this is a very interesting, actually, it's interesting that you raise this, Flavio, because one of the people that's really quite prominent in teaching this language is somebody who's from, and I want to get this right, but I believe he's from the Czech Republic, of all places. And he goes there and he helps to teach the language. And that's a really good example of someone coming in from a different continent and just being brought into the group and getting involved in something really positive for the language and the community. But yeah, have a look at that. And the reason I know it is because there was a film about the Lakota language that we showed at the Polyglot Conference in New York, and we were allowed to show it. And that's where I learned about this community and about the summer school. So yeah, you can go and look for the summer school. Okay. Okay, same applies to Brittany. Yeah, same applies to Brittany. Absolutely. Let me see. Thank you for all your comments and hellos and greetings. I appreciate it. Okay, when you were visiting your sister in Chester, you popped over to Wales, and it was fascinating to see how much character it has. Thank you. I'm glad you liked Chester, and I'm glad you liked, Wales when you went over the border. Yeah. Do you think it's possible to learn a language without going abroad? Yeah, I'll give you an example of someone who does that very well. Luca Lampariello. He'd not been to an English-speaking country for basically almost all of his life, and his English is really, really good. So yeah, it's absolutely possible. Particularly now, you're very lucky. You're living in a place where you've got the internet, so you can learn languages and surround yourself, make your own linguistic bubble wherever you are. Have you ever ventured a bit into the Sorb language? You mean Sorbian, Roman? I've read about them but not studied them. Both, is it north and south, right? Northern and southern Sorbian, is that right? I have, yeah, I've read about them. I've read things in them as well and heard them a little bit, but I understand them to a degree because they're also West Slavic languages, but I'd not studied them actively. The Estonian language? No, I haven't studied the Estonian languages. Have you seen the new Game of Thrones dragon yet? No, I haven't. Link? No, I haven't seen the new Game of Thrones dragon. What's it called? I have no idea. Okay. Well, I didn't speak Welsh yet. In terms of my name, the way you pronounce it is the way I pronounce it in Dutch, so you're all good. Thank you. Dances with Wolves. Oh, yeah. I've seen Dances with Wolves. It's a long time ago. Do you know about the Livonian language? The last native speaker died in 2013, so sad. I hear that there are still speakers of the Livonian language, though. Someone contacted me and reached out and said they still speak it. So I don't know if that's, I don't know how, it's like last native speaker, what does that really mean? Because if there are fluent speakers still around who speak it and it can still be used, then that's good. It's like Manx, for example. On the Isle of Man, we've got this language Manx, and people often talk about, oh, the last native speaker died, but we had very fluent speakers still around, and then they started groups in schools, and now we've got first language speakers again who grew up speaking it from childhood. So even that sometimes can be a little bit ambiguous, so to say, but I don't know. Tempted by a story in Galician. Oh, am I? Yes and no. Yes, because I think they're cool. No, because I think I would end up speaking a weird mishmash of what I speak already, unfortunately. But I mean, I've read things in them and heard them, and I follow a TikToker who talks in and about Galician, and I find it fascinating. For me, it's difficult to stay motivated and learn indigenous languages because there's not enough content, movies, shows, literature to learn it with. That's where it's good to start making connections with the community. So Cornish, you could say that as well, but actually I now have groups of friends and people that use Cornish and speak Cornish and learn Cornish too, who I interact with, and that's become really important to me. So there are things, and you can create things, right? You can start creating Wikipedia articles, for example. So if it's not there, you can help to create it potentially. Okay. Okay, so Laudia, that's been revived. Livonia, okay. Any interest in the language of the Roma? Yeah, absolutely. Inquisitive chimp. Fabulous languages. The Romani languages are actually really interesting because they are so diverse, and how they mix and mesh with other languages where they're spoken in whichever country or region they're spoken in is really interesting as well. But yes, absolutely. I know a few phrases and words and stuff, and I've studied a little bit, but not enough to speak it. But yes, absolutely, and I would absolutely learn one because it's a language that I could potentially use. Okay. I'm seeing that I've got probably more questions than I can answer now, and I haven't answered the ones on Instagram yet. I'm so sorry that I haven't had time to do that, but I've been on for an hour and 15 minutes, and I think my wife might be waiting for me. But I will be back next week. It looks like this is a popular topic, so I'm very happy to talk about it again if you like. We can carry on this conversation. We can talk about more about some of the other questions you've got. I've seen things about dead languages and Latin, and things about obviously taking up the whole thing about the Romani people's languages and cultures are also very important to me, something very dear to my heart, and I would love to talk more about this topic. Put questions in wherever you see this recording. Put questions in for me, tag me and ask me questions, and I will talk about some more of this next week, and I will be absolutely delighted to join you again. And if I didn't get to your question, I'm very, very sorry. I did have a lot of questions and a lot of things to say, and I hope you don't mind. Please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and feel free to get involved in Patreon. And you can also, if you fancy buying me a coffee, you can also buy me a coffee too. There's a link in the YouTube video. I hope you all appreciate also that I've taken off all of the adverts on YouTube for my channel and also for the Polyglot Conference channel. And the reason I've done that is because I think people were bothered that there were annoying adverts, and I'd rather you got access to the information. So I hope you like that change. Take care. See you soon. Enjoy your week and happy language learning. And go out and see if you want to learn an Indigenous, endangered, or vulnerable language too. Join me. Be brave. Go and get it. Take care. See you soon. Bye, everyone.